Thank you for joining Wars of the Roses. As we continue with Part 19, the Royal Exalted Religious and Military Order of Masonic Knights Templar from the Freemason's Manual or Illustrations of Masonry by Jeremiah Howe. Chapter 19. The Royal Exalted Religious and Military Order of Masonic Knights Templar. This the scope was of our former thought, of Sion's fort to scale the noble wall, the Christian folk from bondage to have brought, wherein, alas, they long have lived in thrall, in Palestine an empire to have wrought, where godliness might reign perpetual, and none be left that pilgrims might deny to see Christ's tomb and promised vows to pay. There is much difference of opinion as to the origin of this degree of the Masonic institution, and without attempting to show that the form of conferring the degree is identical with that of the gallant and devoted soldier monks of the Crusades, it cannot be controverted that their institution possessed some features of similarity to Freemasonry. The connection between the Knights Templar and the Masonic institution has been repeatedly asserted by the friends and enemies of both. Brother Laurie says, "We know the Knights Templars not only possessed the mysteries, but performed the ceremonies and inculcated the duties of Freemasons." And he attributes the dissolution of the order to the discovery of their being Freemasons and assembling in secret to practice the rites of the order. He endeavors to show that they were initiated into the order by the Druses, a Syrian fraternity which existed at that date and indeed now continues. In a French manuscript ritual of about 1780, in the degree of black and white eagle, 30 degrees, the transmission of Freemasonry by the Templars is most positively asserted. The history of the Templars and their persecution is minutely described in the closing address, and the Grand Commander adds, "This is my illustrious brother, how and by whom Masonry is derived and has been transmitted to us. You are now a Knight Templar and on a level with them." This is not the practice of the degree in England at the present time, but it was doubtless when it was acknowledged to be connected with the Templar degree. The Order of the Temple in the 12th century was divided into three classes: knights, priests, and serving brethren. Every candidate for admission into the first class must have received the honor of knighthood in due form, and according to the laws of chivalry, and consequently the Knights Templar were all men of noble birth. The second class, or the priests, were not originally a part of the order, but by the bull of Pope Alexander, known as the Bull Omnidatum Optimum, it was ordained that they might be admitted to enable the knights more commodiously to hear divine service and to receive the sacraments. Serving brothers, like the priests, were not a part of the primitive institution. They owed their existence to the increasing prosperity and luxury of the order. Over this society thus constituted was placed a presiding officer with the title of Grand Master. His power, though great, was limited. He was in war the commander-in-chief of all the forces of the temple. In his hands was placed the whole patronage of the order, and as the vicegerent of the Pope, he was the spiritual head and bishop of all the clergy belonging to the society. He was, however, much controlled and guided by the chapter, without whose consent he was never permitted to draw out or expend the money of the order. The Grand Master resided originally at Jerusalem, afterwards, when that city was lost, at Acre, and finally at Cyprus. His duty always required him to be in the Holy Land. He consequently never resided in Europe. He was elected for life from among the knights in the following manner. On the death of the Grand Master, a Grand Prior was chosen to administer the affairs of the order until a successor could be elected. When the day which had been appointed for the election arrived, the chapter usually assembled at the chief seat of the order. 3 or more of the most esteemed knights were then proposed. The Grand Prior collected the votes, and he who had received the greatest number was nominated to be the electing prior. An assistant was then associated with him in the person of another knight. These two remained all night in the chapel engaged in prayer. In the morning they chose 2 others, and these 4, 2 more, and so on, until the number of 12, that of the apostles, had been selected. The 12 then selected a chaplain, The 13 then proceeded to vote for a Grand Master who was elected by a majority of the votes. When the election was completed, it was announced to the assembled brethren, and when all had promised obedience, the prior, if the person was present, said to him, "In the name of God the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, we have chosen and do choose thee, Brother N, to be our master." Then turning to the brethren, he said, "Beloved sirs and brethren, give thanks unto God. Behold here our master." The remaining officers were a marshal who was charged with the execution of the military arrangements on the field of battle. The prior of Jerusalem, called the Grand Preceptor of the Temple, was the treasurer of the order and had charge of all the receipts and expenditures. The draper had the care of the clothing department and distributed the garments to all the brethren. The standard-bearer bore the glorious Beauseant to the field. The Turcopilar was the commander of a body of light horse called Turcopolis, who were employed as skirmishers and light cavalry. And lastly, to the guardian of the chapel was entrusted the care of the portable chapel, which was always carried by the Templars into the field. Each province of the order had a Grand Prior, who was in it the representative of the Grand Master, and each house was governed by a prior or preceptor, who commanded its knights in time of war and presided over its chapter in peace. The mode of reception into the order is described to have been exceedingly solemn. A novitiate was enjoined by the canons, though practically it was in general dispensed with. The candidate was received in a chapter assembled in the chapel of the order, all strangers being rigorously excluded. The preceptor opened the business with an address to those present, demanding if they knew of any just cause or impediment why the candidate should not be admitted. If no objection was made, the candidate was conducted into an adjacent chamber, where 2 or 3 of the knights, placing before his view the rigor and austerities of the order, demanded if he still persisted in entering it. If he persisted, he was asked if he was married or betrothed, had made a vow in any other order, if he owed more than he could pay, if he was of sound body without any secret infirmity and free. If his answers proved satisfactory, they left him and returned to the chapter, and the preceptor again asked if anyone had anything to say against his being received. If all were silent, he asked if they were willing to receive him. On their assenting, the candidate was led in by the knights who had questioned him and who now instructed him in the mode of asking admission. He advanced and, kneeling before the preceptor with folded hands, said, "Sir, I am come before God and before you and the brethren, and I pray and beseech you, for the sake of God and our sweet Lady, to receive me into your society and the good works of the order as one who all his life long will be the servant and slave of the order." The preceptor then inquired of him if he had well considered all the trials and difficulties which awaited him in the order, adjured him on the holy evangelist to speak the truth, and then put to him the questions which had already been asked of him in the preparation room, further inquiring if he was a knight and the son of a knight and gentlewoman, and if he was a priest. He then asked him the following questions. "Do you promise to God and Mary and our dear Lady obedience as long as you live, to the master of the temple and the prior who shall be set over you? Do you promise chastity of the body? Do you further promise a strict compliance with the laudable customs and usages of the order now in force, and such as the master and knights may hereafter add? Will you fight for and defend with all your might the holy land of Jerusalem, and never quit the order but with the consent of the master and chapter? And lastly, do you agree that you never will see a Christian unjustly deprived of his inheritance, nor be aiding in such a deed?" The answers to all these questions being in the affirmative, the preceptor then said, "In the name of God, and of Mary our dear Lady, and in the name of St. Peter of Rome, and of our Father the Pope, and in the name of all the brethren of the temple, we receive you to all the good works of the order, which have been performed from the beginning, and will be performed to the end, you, your father, your mother, and all those of your family whom you let participate therein. So you, in like manner, receive us to all the good works which you have performed and will perform. We assure you of bread and water, the poor clothing of the order, and labor and toil enough." The preceptor then took the white mantle with its ruddy cross, placed it about his neck and bound it fast. The chaplain repeated the 133rd Psalm, "Behold, how good and how pleasant it is for brethren to dwell together in unity," and the prayer of the Holy Spirit, "Deus qui corda fidelium." Each brother said a pater, and the preceptor and chaplain kissed the candidate. He then placed himself at the feet of the preceptor, who exhorted him to peace and charity, to chastity, obedience, humility, and piety, and so the ceremony was ended. The secret mysteries of the Templars, most of the historians say, were celebrated on Good Friday, and what those mysteries were, we discover from those who still carry them on as their heirs. The order is kept up in France and other countries on the continent, not the Masonic institution. They are accustomed in these secret rites to act over the events which took place on the Thursday, Friday, and Saturday of the Holy Week, and then solemnize with great pomp the resurrection of Christ, the deliverer of mankind out of the servitude imposed by sin. Bartolo, in his treatise concerning the cause brought before our Lord Jesus Christ, between the Virgin Mary on the one side and the devil on the other, chose the same 3 days for the hearing of the cause. And on Easter Day, the day of the resurrection, he describes that judge proclaiming mankind freed from Satan's power. Dante also, from the opening of his sublime poem to the end of his first pilgrimage, spent the same 3 days in visiting the servants of Satan in purgatory. On the 3rd day he rose from the dead, and on Easter Day he saw the star of love shining before him. Rossetti observes, in the Ne plus ultra, a Rose-Croix degree, there is reference to the 3 days, the Thursday, Friday, and Saturday of the Holy Week, during which time they represent the Last Supper with the Apostles and the death on the cross at Calvary. It is to be observed that during the persecution of the illustrious Knights of the Temple, which was set on foot by the infamous Clement, assisted by the no less infamous Philippe le Bel of France, a most prominent charge against the order was that they maintained a secret doctrine which was subversive of Christianity. The accusation of irreligion the Templars most strenuously denied, but not so the fact of their possessing certain secrets, which was true beyond all doubt. And secrets they have remained, as far as the outer world is concerned, from that day to this. Not the slightest information has ever been obtained concerning them from any source. Thus much, however, we do know, that the Templars and all the other orders of knighthood possessed certain mysteries and peculiar forms which were confined to themselves, and the rites observed in receiving and affiliating members approached in a remarkable degree to the practice of Freemasonry. They had, for instance, gradations in rank, which may be taken to answer to the degrees in our craft. Some religious ceremonial was used in communicating each additional secret of the order, and to each was attached a solemn obligation. One writer, indeed, Monsieur Rossetti, distinctly asserts that the Templars were a branch of the Masonic institution, whose great object in that age was the overthrow of the papal tyranny and the monstrous fabric it had erected of idolatry, superstition, and impiety. And hence he traces the determination of the Pope to crush at all hazards the order of the Temple with all its daring innovations. Though there is a great probability, if not a certainty, that Masonry was a leading feature in the Templar institution, we are inclined to believe that the mysteries of the craft were the only secrets of their practice. Rossetti, in his work on the anti-papal spirit of the secret societies of Italy in the Middle Ages, especially alludes to the Brethren of the Rose-Croix, who, he says, were framed for the purpose of pulling down the Triple Crown. It was against the temporal power of the papacy they were opposed, not against the Church or the Pope as Bishop of Rome, but against that power inaugurated by Hildebrand, which dethroned kings, excommunicated the nations, and parted husband and wife. Bishop Hurd gives like testimony of those learned ecclesiastics who were members of the Rose-Croix, but who, to conceal their objects, called themselves Brotherhood of the Holy Ghost. The whole conduct of the Knights refutes the charge of any attempt to subvert either Christianity or the Church. In fact, until the attack made upon the Templars by King Philip, the orders of chivalry had always been considered by the Church of Rome as her strongest bulwarks. The esteem in which they were held by her is amply shown in the privileges which were granted to them in every state in Europe, exempting them from all authority except that of the Pope himself, and which in course of time increased the power and pride of the knights to an extent which could not fail to bring upon them the combined jealousy and envy of all the reigning princes of the age, and was one of the principal causes of their downfall. The wonderful architectural and engineering works, which both in Asia and Europe were constructed under the direction of the Templars and Hospitallers, more particularly the former, are, it seems to us, very striking evidence of the Masonic origin of the Knights. Gervase of Canterbury, who wrote in the 12th century, speaks of both French and English artificers skillful to work in stone and in wood, who travelled in guilds or societies for the purpose of proffering their services wherever the architect's and builder's art required to be exercised. These were the only men who possessed the requisite knowledge, and from their ranks kings and princes frequently impressed by violence workmen whom they required to construct their palaces or fortresses. They were the operative Freemasons, to whose surpassing skill and knowledge of the laws of beauty and just proportion we are indebted for the magnificent cathedrals which adorn this country and the continent. They met in lodges close tiled from the vulgar gaze and pursued the practice of their mystic rites under the sanction of the throne and the church. During the First Crusade, we have no record of any building constructed by the warrior pilgrims, but at a later date, after the institution of the Orders of the Temple and St. John, castles, churches, palaces, and hospitals speedily arose on all sides. Their fortresses were of wondrous strength and showed great skill in engineering. Thorn in Poland is indebted for its foundation to Hermann Bulk, Grand Master of the Teutonic Order, who on his arrival in 1231 strongly fortified the ancient castle of Turnau at Old Thorn, and in 1235 removed to the site of the present town. The Gothic cathedral was built by the German knights. The chief seat of the order was soon after removed to Marienburg. The ancient castle with the lofty towers and parapets, which are the remains of the old fortifications, show the strength of headquarters of the order. The remains of the palace of the Grand Master are extremely grand, and the late King of Prussia caused it to be repaired and partially restored to its ancient splendor. This town was built by the knights in 1276. Now, let it be observed that the ranks of the knights of all the orders were recruited from the military but uneducated classes, both noble and plebeian, but who as such were little likely to have any knowledge of the science of architecture, or the art of fortifying with skill the most valuable strategic posts which presented themselves in their progress of conquest. Yet to the present day, the remains of their structural labors testify to the perfection they attained, both as architects and engineers. To what source, then, are we to attribute their skill? Let us see whether the peculiar condition of the Masonic body at that time will not afford an elucidation of the problem. The traveling bodies of Freemasons, which we have mentioned, consisted of brethren well skilled in every branch of knowledge. Among their ranks were many learned ecclesiastics, whose names survive to the present day in the magnificent edifices which they assisted to erect. The Knights of the Temple, themselves a body of military monks, partaking both of the character of soldiers and priests, preserved in their order a rank exclusively clerical, the individuals belonging to which took no part in warfare, who were skilled in letters and devoted themselves to the civil and religious affairs of the order. They were the historians of the period, and we know that all the learning of the time was in their keeping, in common with the other ecclesiastics of the time. From the best information we are possessed of regarding the order, we believe there can be little doubt that these learned clerks introduced the whole fabric of craft masonry into the body of the Templars, and that not only was the speculative branch of the science by them incorporated with the laws and organization of the knights, but to their operative skill were the Templars indebted for their triumphs in architecture and fortification. And it is worthy of remark that in the records of the order, we find no mention of individual architects or builders. We may therefore not unfairly draw the inference that the whole body were made participators in the knowledge and mysteries of the craft. A far different origin and organization than that of Freemasonry has been attributed to the Order of Templars, and to this we will shortly allude, more perhaps to the amusement than the edification of our readers. The argument which we are now about to examine is curious as showing how far the power of prejudice can warp the mind and opinions of a learned and industrious student. Von Hammer, who has acquired a well-deserved and extended celebrity as an antiquary and historian, has actually attempted to identify the Templars and Freemasons with the celebrated Eastern sect of assassins. Speaking of the extent and influence of the latter body, he says, "The Templars incontrovertibly stand in the next rank to them. Their secret maxims, particularly insofar as relates to the renunciation of positive religion and the extension of their power by the acquisition of castles and strong places, seem to have been the same as those of the order of assassins. The accordance likewise of the white dress and red fillet of the assassins with the white mantle and red cross of the Templars is certainly remarkably striking." The assassins were a branch of the Ismailites, the proper Illuminati of the East. The institution of their lodge, with the various grades of initiation, agree completely with what we have heard and read in our own days concerning secret revolutionary societies, and they coincide not less in the form of their constitution than in the common object of declaring all kings and priests superfluous. The ostensible object of this institution was in itself sufficiently laudable, and the exoteric doctrine had merely for its object the extension of knowledge and the mutual support of the members. The greater number of the members were certainly deceived into good faith by the fair exterior of a beneficent, philanthropical knowledge spreading far and wide. They were a kind of Freemasons. As in the West, revolutionary societies arose from the bosom of the Freemasons, so in the East did the assassins spring from the Ismailites. We shall not so far insult the common sense and intelligence of our readers as to enter upon any refutation of the absurdities contained in this extract. The writer's comparison of the costume of the assassins and Templars is simply puerile, while the slanderous assertion of the irreligious and revolutionary principles which he attributes to Freemasonry would be laughable, were we not moved rather to pity his ignorance and malice. However, as Masons, we can well afford to treat with contempt attacks of this kind, well knowing that the principles of our order have for so many centuries blazed forth with undimmed luster, even in the eyes of the profane, that an ignorance of its undoubted virtues can hardly be otherwise than assumed, and as such may be left to a well-merited contempt. We have, however, entered upon this subject in consequence of another author, Adler, of a very different kind, having suggested that Freemasonry was introduced into Europe from the East by the Templars, who had received it from the Ismailites. We think, on the contrary, that there is abundant evidence that it was carried to the East by the learned men who joined the Second Crusade. It is not, however, by any means improbable that the Templars, in the course of their long sojourn in Asia during the frequent truces between the infidels and the Christians, became acquainted, as far as men of differing faith could honestly do, with the Ismailites, which body, doubtless, in its constitution and government, had some points of resemblance to their own. Of this tribe, the Ismailites, little is distinctly known, and we are inclined to think that the prejudice of the earlier Christian writers has given them a far worse character than was really their due. For their other name of assassins, which has come to be a term of infamy in Europe, we presume our readers are aware that it was derived from the Eastern drug hashish, a vile preparation of hemp used by devotees in the East to this day, and in which no doubt the followers of the old man of the mountain, as their chief was called, indulged when about to undertake any desperate enterprise. The Crusaders, who suffered from the daring attacks of this tribe, naturally ascribed every crime to the hated Hashishin, and the word has come down to our time as the most degrading epithet which can be applied to man. The Druses of Mount Lebanon are the undoubted descendants of this tribe of Ismailites. All travelers agree that these people have preserved a strict morality and a sober and decent deportment. The religious doctrine which they profess appears to be a pure Unitarianism. Even at the present day are found traces of an association similar to those which doubtless existed amongst their ancestors in the time of the Crusaders. There is preserved by this singular people an institution which has many similar points to the Masonic order, excepting that we are told both sexes are admissible. It requires a probation of 12 months previous to the admission of a member. In the second year, he assumes the distinguishing mark of the white turban, and afterwards, by degrees, is allowed to participate in the whole of the mysteries. Simplicity of attire, self-denial, temperance, and irreproachable moral conduct are essential to admission to the order. To return to the subject more immediately before us, we have shown that the early Freemasons were the architects of all structures above the hovels of the peasantry, and we have endeavored to trace to Masonic influence the eminence attained in structural science by the various knightly orders. Though the original object of these institutions was the protection and assistance of the Christian pilgrims whose piety had led them to the Holy Land, there is no doubt that with increasing power and influence, the views of the knights became much changed and extended. In our opinion, there is little room to doubt that the practice of Masonry soon became a prominent feature of the order, and that Masonic secrets alone were the far-famed mysteries of the Templars. As it is evident that these pursuits would not in the eyes of the world appear to further the original objects of the chivalric orders, we cannot be surprised that the knights made no profession of their Masonic studies. Perhaps, even at that remote period, there was a well-grounded fear of the animosity which has been since so fearfully developed in the Church of Rome against all secret societies. That power has ever trembled at the progress of liberality and science, knowing full well that in proportion as the intellect of man is strengthened by freedom of thought, her influence, founded upon blind superstition and puerile credulity, must gradually disappear from the earth. In illustration of the alarm of the Papal Church at societies of this kind, we will refer, though not strictly belonging to our subject, to the Academy of Secrets, established in Italy in the 16th century by Baptista Porta for the advancement of science. This association was called I Secreti and was accessible only to such as had made some new discovery, real or supposed, in physical science. Porta did not content himself with this private means of instruction and education. He also, to the utmost of his power, promoted public academies wherein were taught the then recondite sciences of chemistry, optics, and natural history. His voluminous works extended his fame, and he was visited by the learned from all parts of Europe. Such a man in that age could not escape the notice and pressing attentions of Holy Church. Writing, of course, much that was perfectly incomprehensible to the ignorant priests of the time, he was summoned to Rome to answer for his conduct and opinions, the charge of magic being brought against him, as was the established rule at that time when anything scientific passed the understanding of the spiritual gentry. Eventually, Porta was released, but his society was suppressed. Numerous absurdities may be traced in his works owing to the imperfect light which fell to his lot. He was, nevertheless, a philosopher and a man of practice as well as theory. To him we owe the camera obscura and a variety of optical, chemical, and other valuable experiments instituted by him have in later ages produced fruitful results. And here we may pause to notice the wonderful results which were produced directly and indirectly by the institutions of chivalry. That society ultimately benefited by them, there can be no doubt. The rise of independent corporate bodies even may in some degree be traced to this source. The great feudal chiefs, anxious in many instances to join in the glories and spiritual benefits of the Crusades, in order to raise supplies of men and money, sold their seigneurial rights to their vassals, and many towns and cities which had been previously under the protection of some mighty lord were compelled to combine for mutual defense. Hence arose free cities, charters and franchises, institutions to which England and Europe owe whatever they possess of national liberty. The influence of a religious feeling immediately before and during the period of the Crusades upon the progress of architectural science is admirably displayed by Michaud in the following remarks. In the 10th century, architecture consisted in the construction of towers, ramparts, and fortresses. In the habitations of the great, everything was sacrificed to the necessity of providing defenses against an enemy. Nothing could be afforded to comfort or magnificence. The dwellings of the people, even in cities, scarcely protected them from the injuries of weather or the intemperance of the seasons. The only architectural monuments were those which devotion raised to ancestors. Before magnificent palaces for princes or convenient houses for the rich were thought of, edifices consecrated to religion were constructed. It is scarcely possible to enumerate the churches and monasteries built in the 11th and 12th centuries. According to the opinion of the time, the most certain mode of expiating sins was to build a church or a monastery. Thus, architectural monuments arose at the voice of repentance, and religious inspirations revived in some sort the prodigies which fabulous antiquity attributed to the lyre of Amphion. In every city and every town, the inhabitants made it their pride to ornament their cathedral, and the altars at which they invoked the saint whom the parish had chosen for its patron. It may be said that there was something like patriotism in this pious zeal, for the basilica or paternal church was then the most noble and the most sensible image of the country. At the commencement of the Crusades, there existed a religious confraternity composed of men practiced in the labors of building. They traveled about the world offering their services to the faithful to build or repair churches. Another confraternity was formed with the useful design of constructing bridges for pilgrims and travelers. A chapel or an oratory reminded passengers that the bridge they were crossing was the work of charity. The clergy, who were rich and could only display their opulence in buildings, made it their glory to erect churches. To complete their work, they called in the aid of painting and sculpture, which, like architecture, owed their first encouragement to piety, and whose earliest masterpieces were consecrated to the ornamenting of the altars of the Christian religion. Nothing was more common than to see noble crusaders, on their departure for Palestine or on their return to the West, found a monastery or a church. Several pilgrims are named who, on coming back from Jerusalem, employed their treasures in constructing churches, the form of which might offer them an image of the Holy Sepulchre they had visited. The treasures conquered from the infidels were often appropriated to such buildings. The origin and progress of the pointed arch has been rendered one of the most complicated problems in the history of architecture. It was during the 12th and 13th centuries this innovation upon the long monotony of the circular arch appeared and was perfected. This style, which bears the name of Gothic, is by writers of eminence assumed to be of Oriental growth, and by Wren's theory that the Freemasons were its inventors. Its earliest adoption was undoubtedly in England, and we have abundant evidence that the splendid specimens of Gothic architecture that cover our own land and adorn many continental cities were built by Freemasons. Numerous indeed have been the conjectures, and various the writers, upon the interesting subject of the secret associations and practices of the early Crusaders. Some of these authors have brought to bear upon the subject much learning and archaeological knowledge, whilst others are more distinguished for the enthusiastic views they hold upon the subject than for any great value that can be attached to their real or supposed discoveries. Prejudice and ignorance have of course been frequently busy in detraction of these orders as being more or less connected with the essence of Masonry. We have, however, the satisfaction of knowing that, while those writers who have attacked the Templars are gradually sinking into well-deserved obscurity, there is, on the other hand, a brilliant galaxy of advocates of the Masonic and general virtues of the Knights. A somewhat peculiar theory as to the Masonic customs of the Knights was held by Hutchinson, who in his Spirit of Masonry, a work which claims for our institution a far more exalted origin than the mere practice of building, has the following remarkable observations. No sooner was Christianity fully developed in this land, England, than all Europe was inflamed with the cry and madness of an enthusiastic monk, Peter the Hermit, who prompted the zealots in religion to the Holy War, in which, for the purpose of recovering the Holy City and Judea out of the hands of the infidels, armed legions of saints, devotees, and enthusiasts in tens of thousands poured forth from every state of Europe to waste their blood and treasure in a purpose as barren and unprofitable as it was impolitic. It was deemed necessary that those who took up the ensign of the cross in this enterprise should form themselves into such societies as might secure them from spies and treacheries. and that each might know his companion and brother as well in the dark as by day. As it was with Jephthah's army at the passes of the Jordan, so also was it requisite in these expeditions that certain signs, signals, watchwords or passwords should be known amongst them. For the armies consisted of various nations and divers languages. No project or device could answer the purposes of the Crusaders better than those of Masonry. The maxims and ceremonials attending the Master's Order had been previously established and were materially necessary on that expedition. For as the Mohammedans were also worshippers of the deity, and as the enterprisers were seeking a country where the Masons were in the time of Solomon called into an association, and where some remains would certainly be found of the mysteries and wisdom of the ancients and of our predecessors, such degrees of Masonry as extended only to the acknowledgement of their being servants of the God of nature would not have distinguished them from those they had to encounter had they not assumed the symbols of the Christian faith. All the learning of Europe in those times, as in the ages of antiquity, was possessed by the religious priesthood. They had acquired the wisdom of the ancients and the original knowledge which was in the beginning and now is the truth. Many of them had been initiated into the mysteries of Masonry. They were the projectors of this enterprise, and as Solomon at the building of the temple introduced orders and regulations for the conduct of the work, which his wisdom had been enriched with from the learning of the sages of antiquity, so that no confusion should happen during its progress, and so that the rank and office of each fellow laborer might be distinguished and ascertained beyond the possibility of deceit. In like manner, the priests projecting the Crusades, being possessed of the mysteries of Masonry, the knowledge of the ancients and of the universal language which survived the confusion of Shinar, revived the orders and regulations of Solomon and initiated the legions therein who followed them to the Holy Land, hence that secrecy which attended the Crusaders. Amongst other evidence which authorizes me in the conjecture that Masons went to the Holy Wars is the doctrine of that order of Masons called the Higher Order. I'm induced to believe that order was of Scottish extraction. Separate nations might be distinguished by some separate order as they were by peculiar ensigns. But be that as it may, it fully proves to me that Masons were Crusaders. But supposing the mysteries of the Templars might not have been wholly connected with those of Freemasonry, still there can be little doubt that many of the Templar order were Freemasons and initiated into the secrets of occult philosophy or the Rosicrucian order. Having endeavored thus far to trace the peculiarities of the order of Templars, we will for the present leave that most interesting subject, upon which very much more might be said, and will draw the reader's attention to the fact that secret societies of a totally different kind existed in this country and on the continent long before the era of the Crusades. These were in fact associations by which men were enabled to gain subsistence for themselves and fellows. The accounts handed down to us by the earliest Anglo-Saxon writers whose works have been preserved and which are amply corroborated by Stowe, Fitzstephen and others, describe these associations very fully under the name of guilds or guilds as bodies maintaining certain secrets for the benefit of their own order. They were ecclesiastical and secular, the former for the practice of alms deeds, the latter both for trade and arms. Both were distinguished for their religious observances and partook much of the nature of monastic institutions. The trading guilds have survived, of course in a modified form, to the present day, and, as our readers may have noticed, an effort has not been unsuccessfully made within the last few years by a certain party in the Church of England to revive the religious guilds, which are again flourishing under the names of divers saints, as the Guild of St. Francis, the Holy Guild of Poor Brethren of St. Cuthbert, etc. The great and important livery companies of the City of London are derived from these trading guilds. The word guild, geld, or gelt, as it is variously written, has many significations among the earlier writers. It is used to signify primarily a payment, mulct, composition, or amercement. It also denoted an enfranchised district, otherwise called soke, as in the wards of the City of London, and moreover was used for the free customs and privileges of such guild or soke. In later times, its most usual acceptation was in the sense of an associated brotherhood or body, which might be a whole town, or only a minor incorporation. Of such, every member was a guildar, that is, a contributor to the support of the general body. The learned Johnson defines the word as meaning fraternities originally contributing sums to a common stock. The word is to be found in various tongues, in Old French, Teutonic and Icelandic. Gilde, convivium, symposium, a society, a fraternity or company combined by orders and laws made amongst themselves and by their prince's license. Hence the word guild proceeds, being a fraternity or commonalty of men gathered together in one combination, supporting their common charges by mutual contribution. Very great antiquity can be claimed for these and similar societies. They may even be traced to classical times, in which it is well known that artificers and traders were formed into companies like those of later days and even occupied particular localities to which they gave name. To this Fitzstephen has alluded in his description of London in the year 1180. This city, even as Roma, is divided into wards, and all the sellers of wares and all the workmen for hire are distinguished every morning, each in his place and everyone in his own street. The Anglo-Saxon guilds were an undoubted element in the origin of some of the most valuable points of our constitution, and sprang from the Saxon custom of frank pledge, that the members of the guilds might the better identify each other, as well as ascertain whether any man was absent on unlawful business. It was their custom to assemble at stated periods when they ate and drank together. The guilds devoted to religious or to trading objects, which afterwards arose, copied not only the convivialities, but also most of the customs of their predecessors. These ecclesiastical guilds are mentioned so early as the Capitula of Carloman in the year 770, and the records of our Anglo-Saxon synods mention that both laymen and priests were members of these confraternities. A custom prevailed in those early times of dividing whole towns into guilds, the government of which consisted of a triple estate: the chief or president, the council, and the members or associates. A favorite number of the council, including the chief, was 13, alluding to our Lord and the 12 apostles. To such a source may be traced the origin of Portsoken Ward in the city of London. In the days of King Edgar, more than 600 years since, says Old Stowe, there were 13 knights or soldiers well beloved of the king and the realm for service done by them, which requested to have a certain portion of land on the east part of the city, left desolate and forsaken by the inhabitants by reason of too much servitude. They besought the king to have this land with the liberty of a guild forever. The king granted their request, with conditions following, that is to say that each of them should victoriously accomplish 3 combats, one above ground, one underground, and the third in the water. And after this, on a certain day in East Smithfield, they should run with spears against comers, all which was gloriously performed, and the same day the king named it Knighton Guild. To this fraternity a charter was granted by Edward the Confessor, and it continued to flourish for several centuries. In 1145, however, Queen Maud founded the Priory of the Holy Trinity, which she endowed by the transfer of the lands of the Knighton Guild, the other rights and privileges of that ancient corporation being transferred to certain burgesses of the City of London who had the right to be a guild or trade corporation reserved to them. A curious anomaly arose in consequence. The Prior of the Holy Trinity became the territorial lord and alderman of Portsoken Ward. It is said that a memorial of the ancient Knighton Guild has descended to our own days in the corrupted name of Nightingale Lane. These several associations of Anglo-Saxon origin had each its secrets, and the same principle of union united them, assimilated in a great degree to that sacred bond of brotherhood which has ever characterized the institution of Freemasonry. We may observe that ecclesiastics identified themselves both with the peaceful guilds and with those devoted to the profession of arms, and we have ample proof that they were fostered and patronized by the Church of Rome until the period when the wealth of some of the chivalric orders, having attracted the envy of both prince and pontiff, they first fell a sacrifice, and the policy of the Church ever afterwards denounced all secret associations as irreligious and heretical. The associations of trading guilds, however, continued to flourish in England, and especially in the City of London, all the great companies of which, till within a recent period, kept up a show of preserving the customs and secrets of the ancient guilds. In these guilds, all the more important and essential processes of their crafts were concealed as mysteries in the true sense of the term. During the earlier periods, the hereditary character of the handicraft must have greatly assisted in preventing the profane from withdrawing the veil. Other means were practiced for the purpose of keeping the secrets of the trades and defending their monopoly, including many awe-inspiring ceremonies and initiations, sometimes terrific, sometimes painful or ludicrous. Here the candidate trembled beneath the arch of steel with swords suspended over his head. There, unless his agility preserved him, the incipient workman enjoyed the full application of the lash of the whip. The aspirant admitted into the worshipful company of cooks binds himself under a heavy penalty not to reveal to any stranger the secret of raising puff paste. The most celebrated and enduring of these ancient guilds on the continent was the League of the Hanseatic Towns. This far-famed commercial confederacy was established during the rule, if not by the direct influence, of the Order of Teutonic Knights. The name is derived from the ancient German word Hanse, signifying an association for mutual support and defense. The Hanseatic League maintained ships and soldiers at their joint expense to protect their commerce from pirates and enemies. In 1428, they had a fleet of 248 ships and maintained a force of 20,000 soldiers. This extraordinary association and the Great Order of Teutonic Knights flourished at the same period. During the 200 years from 1260 to 1450, they were perhaps at their highest power and in the most perfect organization. The Teutonic Order eventually became absorbed into the electorate of Brandenburg. The Hanse towns existed as free republics until the year 1810, when they were crushed by the despotic rule established over Europe by the first Napoleon. The illustrious Order of the Temple has, through many vicissitudes, survived to our times. And indeed, of late years, a great, and we may say, an astonishing, influence has been exercised in the Masonic craft by this brotherhood in England, on the continent of Europe, and in the United States. Notwithstanding the persecution the order was subjected to, consequent upon the machinations of Philip le Bel and Pope Clement, it continued to exist, if not to flourish. Jacques de Molay, the martyred Grand Master, in anticipation of his fate, appointed his successor to rule the fraternity, and from that time to the present there has been an uninterrupted succession of Grand Masters. It is true that as years passed on, and clouds arose still more ominous to the existence of the society, the Templars, we believe there is no doubt, amalgamated their body with that of their ancient brothers in arms, the Knights of St. John, or as they were afterwards called, from the island that became their headquarters, the Knights of Malta. In the preceptories of the order which remained in England, the secrets imparted to the newly installed brother of the temple included for many years the degrees known as Knight of St. John and Knight of Malta. With these were also conferred the Rose Croix of Herodom, one of the higher degrees which, it is said, was originally brought into this country from Scotland, where, as well as in Ireland, many interesting, curious and even valuable Masonic rites are preserved, which are generally unknown to the younger English Masons, and the Kadosh, or Ne Plus Ultra of Masonry. Of the Kadosh there are said to be 6 degrees, and however worked, we are at liberty to say that there is little doubt that they are intimately connected with the ancient ceremonies of the Order of the Temple. We have spoken of the widespread influence of the Templar order at the present day. The fact is, however, not perhaps known to the generality of our readers, that the vows of this degree were embraced to as great, if not to a greater extent in proportion to the Masonic population of Great Britain a century ago than at the present time. Great, and we fear not to say unpardonable, neglect has been manifested with regard to the records of the order at that period, and the documents which have been preserved are meager in the extreme. The influence of this noble order has been widely exercised on the continent. In France and Italy, chapters of the chivalric degrees have always been held, and latterly under the sanction of the Church. At Sonnenberg in Germany, there was a grand encampment of the Knights of St. John early in the present century, where several German princes were elevated to the privileges of the order, amongst whom were Leopold of Saxe-Coburg, the present sovereign of Belgium, and Michaud, the historian of the Crusades. In Prussia, the military orders flourish, and there is good ground for tracing their preservation up to the Teutonic Order, the knights of which were the original founders of the power of the Prussian monarchy. It is not unreasonable to conclude that a portion of the persecuted Brotherhood of the Temple sought refuge with their more prosperous fellow soldiers of the Teutonic Order, and that their secrets and ceremonies may have been thus perpetuated in the north of Europe, while the Knights of St. John preserved them in the south. The sovereigns of Prussia have always been patrons of Masonry in every form. Their descent from the illustrious Grand Master of the Teutonic Order may, it is not improbable, have influenced their predilections. Be that as it may, it is well known that they have always, and more particularly since the time of Frederick the Great, manifested the warmest interest in the affairs of the craft. The active part taken by that illustrious prince in Masonry is indeed surprising when we consider the magnitude and importance of his military and political transactions. He is known to have attained to the greatest proficiency in what are known as the higher degrees in Freemasonry, and established in Prussia the Supreme Council of Grand Inspectors General, in order to preserve to his successors the Masonic privileges which he possessed as the acknowledged head of that right. The Templar degree derived its origin in this country from two sources: France and Germany. The Cross of Christ encampment, held at Clerkenwell, was of French origin. The observance was from Germany and presided over by Brother Burckhardt. The Knights Templar degree is highly valued in all countries, and its ritual is, we believe, identical. The candidate for its honors in England must be a Royal Archmason, and as such he presents himself at the encampment, as the meetings are called, in the character and garb of a pilgrim or palmer, as they were designated in the Holy Land. He figuratively undergoes 7 years' travel and then 7 years' warfare. When, having conducted himself courageously through his trials, he is finally admitted into the order. It need hardly be said that this is entirely a Christian degree, and into it none but such as are professors of Christianity can be admitted. There is not a vestige of Freemasonry as such in the degree, save the absolute necessity of candidates having been admitted into the Royal Arch. The New Testament is, except one slight extract, exclusively used for illustration, and the three great lights represent Peter, James, and John. The object of this degree is similar to that of the Rose-Croix Knight, but whereas that deals with the event of man's redemption in an allegory, this celebrates the fact. The obligation of a Masonic Knight Templar is not unlike that taken by the soldier monk, and he becomes by his vow a soldier of the cross. The officers of Grand Conclave are Most Eminent and Supreme Grand Master, Sir Knight William Stewart of Aldenham Abbey, Herts; Very Eminent Deputy Grand Master, Sir Knight Colonel George Augustus Vernon; Grand Seneschal, Sir Knight Right, Honourable the Earl of Carnarvon. The other officers appointed annually are Grand Prior and Sub-Prior, Grand Prelate, First and Second Grand Captains, Grand Chancellor and Vice-Chancellor, Grand Registrar, Grand Treasurer, Grand Chamberlain, Grand Hospitaller, Grand Constable or Mareschal, Grand Provost, First and Second Grand Experts, First and Second Grand Standard Bearers, Grand Almoner, Grand Director of Ceremonies, First and Second Grand Aide-de-Camp, First and Second Grand Captain of Lines, Grand Sword Bearer, 2 Grand Heralds, Grand Superintendent of Works, Grand Organist, Grand Banner Bearer, and 2 Grand Equerries. No encampment can install a knight into the order for a less sum than 3 guineas, except in case of a serving brother for which a dispensation is necessary. The costume of the degree is as follows: badge, a white kid skin with a border of black watered ribbon, the ribbon to be 4 inches broad. In the center of the badge, a red cross patee in velvet or embroidery. A belt of black silk velvet, 5 inches broad in front, is worn attached to the badge. The belt has on the front the emblems of mortality in a triangle in silver. Grand officers are distinguished by the black ribbon being intersected by 3 white stripes. A sash of black watered ribbon 4 inches wide is worn over the right shoulder. Commanders are distinguished by having gold fringe and button at the ends. Grand officers' sashes have 3 white stripes. The members of Grand Conclave are all present and past Grand Officers, all present and past Commanders, and the present Captains of private encampments. The Grand Conclave is held on the second Friday in the month of May at Freemasons' Hall, London. Every encampment must be constituted by a warrant or patent with the Great Seal of the Order affixed and under the sign manual of the Grand Master, and witnessed by the Deputy Grand Master and the Grand Chancellor. The form of petition for a warrant for opening a new encampment is as follows. To the Grand Conclave of the Royal Exalted and Military Order of Knights Templar in England and Wales and the colonial dependencies of the British Crown. We, the undersigned, being regularly registered members of encampments mentioned against our respective names, having the prosperity of the order at heart, are anxious to exert our best endeavors to promote and diffuse the genuine principles of the ancient order of Masonic Knights Templar, and for the greater convenience of our brethren and other good reasons are desirous of establishing a new encampment. To be named the encampment and pray for a warrant of constitution empowering us to meet as a regular encampment on the day of the months of in every year, and there to discharge our duties in a constitutional manner according to the statutes of the Royal Exalted and Military Order of Masonic Knights Templar in England and Wales, and have nominated and do recommend Sir Knight as first eminent commander and Sir Knights as first and second captains of the said encampment. The prayer of the petitioners being granted, we promise strict obedience to the commands of the most eminent and supreme Grand Master and the laws and statutes of the Grand Conclave. To be signed by 7 Knights of the Order. The fee for a warrant is 5 guineas, which must be remitted to the Vice-Chancellor with the petition. Every encampment must consist of an eminent commander, a prelate, 2 captains, a registrar who acts as secretary, a treasurer, an almoner, an expert, 2 standard-bearers, a captain of the lines, 2 heralds, and an equerry. The ritual, from its solemnity, is most impressive. The encampment is opened by a prayer to the Redeemer, so to direct the suppliants' labors that they may be inspired with love to him, affection to their companions, protection to the distressed, and obedience to the order. It is closed with this prayer. O merciful Lord, grant thy holy protection and salutary blessing to this encampment. Enlighten its rulers with the rays of thy brightness, that they may always see the just ways of our heavenly captain, and may by their example induce the companions committed to their charge, so to follow them through this wilderness of temptation, that having overcome the enemies of thy holy name, they may arrive at the heavenly Jerusalem armed with the shield of faith and the breastplate of righteousness, through Jesus Christ our Savior. In the ceremony of installing a knight, he is invested with the armor, while the prelate reads from the book of Ephesians, chapter 6, verses 10 through 17. Finally, my brethren, be strong in the Lord and in the power of his might. Put on the whole armor of God, that ye may be able to stand against the wiles of the devil. For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places. Wherefore take unto you the whole armor of God, that ye may be able to withstand in the evil day, and having done all to stand. Stand therefore, having your loins girt about with truth, and having on the breastplate of righteousness, and your feet shod with the preparation of the gospel of peace. Above all, taking the shield of faith, wherewith ye shall be able to quench all the fiery darts of the wicked, and take the helmet of salvation, and the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God. The novitiate is then thus addressed. Pilgrim, now a novice of the order, the ceremonies in which you are now engaged are calculated deeply to impress your mind, and we trust will have a long and happy effect on your future character. You were first, as a trial of your faith and humility, enjoined to perform a 7 years pilgrimage, which represented the pilgrimage of life through which we are all passing. We are all weary pilgrims looking forward to the asylum, where we shall rest from our labors and be at rest forever. You were then directed as a trial of your courage and constancy to perform 7 years of warfare. It represented the constant warfare with the living vanities and deceits of this world, in which it is necessary for us to be always engaged. You are now called upon to perform 1 year of humility, and it is also a trial of the faith which will conduct you safe over the dark gulf of everlasting death, and land your enfranchised spirit in the peaceful abode of the blessed. Let the emblems of life and death now before you remind you of the uncertainty of human life, and lead you to be prepared for the closing hour of existence. And rest assured that a firm faith in the truths revealed to us will afford you consolation in the gloomy hour of dissolution, and ensure ineffable and eternal bliss in the world to come. After the novitiate has undergone his trials of fortitude and courage, during which is read the first epistle of Peter, chapter 2, verses 1 through 17. Wherefore, laying aside all malice and all guile and hypocrisies and envies and all evil speakings, as newborn babes desire the sincere milk of the word, that ye may grow thereby, if so be ye have tasted that the Lord is gracious. To whom coming, as unto a living stone, disallowed indeed of men, but chosen of God and precious, ye also as lively stones are built up a spiritual house and holy priesthood, to offer up spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God by Jesus Christ. Wherefore also it is contained in the Scripture, Behold, I lay in Sion a chief cornerstone, elect precious, and he that believeth on him shall not be confounded. Unto you therefore which believe he is precious, but unto them which be disobedient the stone which the builders disallowed, the same is made the head of the corner, and a stone of stumbling and a rock of offense, even to them which stumble at the word, being disobedient, whereunto also they were appointed. But ye are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, an holy nation, a peculiar people, that ye should show forth the praises of him who hath called you out of darkness into his marvelous light, which in time past were not a people, but are now the people of God, which had not obtained mercy, but now have obtained mercy. Dearly beloved, I beseech you, as strangers and pilgrims, abstain from fleshly lusts, which war against the soul, having your conversation honest among the Gentiles, that, whereas they speak against you as evildoers, they may by your good works, which they shall behold, glorify God in the day of visitation. Submit yourselves to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake, whether it be to the king as supreme, or unto governors, as unto them that are sent by him for the punishment of evildoers, and for the praise of them that do well. For so is the will of God, that with well-doing ye may put to silence the ignorance of foolish men, as free, and not using your liberty for a cloak of maliciousness, but as the servants of God. Honor all men, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the king. A small cube of marble is presented to him, in illustration of which is read from the book of Revelation, chapter 2, verse 17. He that hath an ear, let him hear what the Spirit saith unto the churches. To him that overcometh will I give to eat of the hidden manna, and will give him a white stone, and in the stone a new name written, which no man knoweth, saving he that receiveth it. The sacred emblems of the order are the lamb, the dove, and the cock. The first is emblematic of the paschal lamb slain from the foundation of the world, the dove, of the Almighty Comforter, which descended in a bodily shape on Jesus Christ at his baptism, when his divine mission was indicated to John the Baptist. The cock, the monitor of the order, for his crowing heralds the morn, especially calls to our remembrance our duties as Knights Templar, and reminds us to ask thus early for assistance to perform them throughout the coming day. May we ever welcome the sound as a friendly caution, and not have reason to fear it as the periodical memorial of a broken vow. The installation of the eminent commander has reference to an event in the Holy Wars. At the time when the Crusaders were led by Godfrey de Bouillon to Jerusalem, he, being anxious to have a first sight of the holy city, pushed forward with a few followers, and being in advance, on arriving at an elevated point near to a village, distant 60 furlongs from Jerusalem, he saw the towers and pinnacles of the city shining bright with the morning sun. He turned round to his companions in arms, and made known their near approach, as had been agreed, by informing them they were at Emmaus. The emblem of Knights of the Order is a cross patee. Commanders and past commanders wear the patriarchal cross, which is suspended by a white watered, or in some cases by a Syrian ribbon. The Grand Master is distinguished by the Triple Cross of Salem. The star of the order is of silver with 7 points. It has a passion cross in the center, around which is the motto, In hoc signo vinces. The cloak or mantle is of white camlet with a cape or hood. On the left shoulder is the cross, to which the wearer is entitled, in red silk. Roll of encampments registered under the Grand Conclave of England and Wales, 1861. Abbey Chapter, Assembly Rooms, Low Pavement, Nottingham. Albert Littleborough, near Rochdale. All Souls, Masonic Hall, Weymouth. Almeric de St. Maur, Queen's Arms Hotel, Bolton. Ascalon, Poona, East Indies. Beauseant, New Inn, Handsworth, Staffordshire, Bermuda, Hamilton, Bermuda, Bladude No. 3, Westgate Buildings, Bath, Calpe, General Lodge Rooms, Gibraltar, Coeur de Lion, Masonic Hall, Oxford, Cornubian or Conclave of the Holy City, Masonic Hall, Falmouth, De Furnivall, Sheffield, Edmund Plantagenet, New Inn, Openshaw, Excelsior in HM 21st Foot, Royal North British Fusilier, Barbados, Faith, Bradford, Yorkshire, Faith, Horseshoe Inn, Pendleton, Lancashire, Faith and Fidelity or Early Grand Encampment of England, Freemasons Tavern, Great Queen Street, London, Fernley, Masonic Hall, Dewsbury West, Yorkshire, Frederick of Unity, London Tavern, Bishopsgate Street, Godefroy de Bouillon, Hamilton, Canada West, Godefroy de Bouillon, Wheatsheaf Inn, Stoke-upon-Trent, Staffordshire, Geoffrey de St. Omer, Palestine Hotel, Manchester, Geoffrey de St. Aldemar, Masonic Hall, Toronto, Canada West, Holy Cross, George Hotel, Axminster, Holy Trinity, Grapes Inn, New Street, Whitehaven, Hope, Freemasons Hall, Fitzwilliam Street, Huddersfield, Howe, Masonic Rooms, Newhall Street, Birmingham, Hugh de Payens, Masonic Hall, Kingston, Canada West, Hugh de Payens, Old Bull Hotel, Blackburn, Jacques de Molay, Masonic Temple, No. 22, Hope Street, Liverpool, Jacques de Molay, Sandhurst, Victoria, Australia, Jerusalem, Masonic Lodge Rooms, Cross Street, Manchester, Joppa, Sunderland, Chemis Tinter, Masonic Hall, William Street, Woolwich, Kent, Loyal Ashton-under-Lyne Encampment of Volunteers, Swan Inn, Stamford Street, Ashton-under-Lyne, Loyal Brunswick, St. George's Hall, Stonehouse, Plymouth, Love and Friendship, Vernon Arms, Stockport, Melita, Valletta, Malta, Mount Calvary, Ship and Turtle, Leadenhall Street, Mount Carmel, London Tavern, Bishopsgate Street, Mount Zion, Bombay, East Indies, Nova Scotia, Freemasons Hall, Halifax, Nova Scotia, Observance, Thatched House, St. James's Street, Observance, Masonic Temple of the Lodge of Perfect Unanimity, Madras, Pembroke, Tattersall's Hotel, Melbourne, Australia, Plains of Mamre, Cross Keys, Burnley, Plains of Rama in the room of the Royal Yorkshire Lodge, Keighley, Prince Edward, Station House, Bottom Stanfield, Todmorden, Prudence, Great White Horse Hotel, Ipswich, Richard Coeur de Lion, London, Canada West, Richard de Vernon, Dudley Arms Hotel, Dudley, Worcester, Royal Edward Astley Arms Inn, Dukinfield, Royal Gloucester, Freemasons Hall, Southampton, Royal Kent, Freemasons Hall, Bell Court, Newgate Street, Newcastle on Tyne, Royal Kent, Calcutta, East Indies, Royal Naval, Phoenix Lodge Rooms, High Street, Portsmouth, Royal Sussex, Freemasons Hall, Tiverton, Royal Veteran, Golden Fleece Inn, East Street, Plymouth, Salamanca, No. 2, Westgate, Halifax, York, Sepulchre, Bengal, East Indies, St. Augustine, Lahore, Punjab, St. George, formerly Cross of Christ, Radley's Hotel, Bridge Street, Blackfriars, London, St. George's Angel Inn, Oldham, St. James of Jerusalem, alternately at the Rising Sun, 3 Tons, and the Legs of Man, Bolton, St. John of Jerusalem, Queen's Hotel, Todmorden, St. John, Simla, East Indies, St. Joseph, Masonic Rooms, Cross Street, Manchester, St. Michael, Mason's Arms, Newchurch, Lancashire, St. Michael and St. George, Corfu, St. Salem, Dog and Partridge Inn, Stockport, Stewart, Freemasons Hall, Watford, Temple Creasing, George Hotel, Colchester, Trinity and Unity, Assembly Rooms, Barnstaple, Tinter, Encampment of Redemption through Christ, Taunton, Somersetshire, Union or Rougemont, Masonic Hall, Exeter, William de la Moore the Martyr, Quebec, William de la Moore, Queen's Hotel, Manchester, the King Baldwin, Belleville, Canada West. With regard to the present government of the order, we must acknowledge that serious anomalies have arisen, which we would gladly see reconciled. According to the constitutions of the order, it is clear that there can be but one Supreme Grand Master, whose authority all preceptories, or as they are now termed encampments, are bound to acknowledge. The subordinate heads of the Brotherhood in the various parts of Christendom are properly designated Masters or Grand Priors. If then the succession of Grand Masters is allowed to have continued unbroken in France, it is clear that to the Grand Master of the Temple in Paris belongs the right of appointment of the heads of all subordinate preceptories or encampments. If, on the other hand, this authority be disavowed, to whom of right belongs the rule of the order, and what becomes of its ancient customs, traditions, and landmarks? When the late Duke of Sussex was in the zenith of his power as Grand Master of Masons in England, he wished to obtain also the supreme authority in the higher degrees, as well in craft as Royal Arch Masonry, And to this end, carrying out the wishes of the majority of the brethren in this country, he applied to the Emperor Alexander of Russia as the nominal head of the Knights of Malta for authority to rule the chivalric orders established in this country, and received from that potentate the title of Grand Prior of England, uniting under his control the 3 degrees of Knights Templar, Knights of St. John, and Knights of Malta. At the Duke's death, the supreme authority in England was conferred upon that very worthy and highly esteemed Mason, the late Colonel Chemis Tinter, who was styled Grand Master of the Knights Templar, an innovation which caused considerable discontent at the time and in some measure tended to results to be regretted. Brother William Stewart of Aldenham Abbey, Herts, eldest son of the late Archbishop of Armagh, is the present Grand Master of the Order. Under the ancient and accepted rite reference is made to the Templar and the other degrees connected with it which were conferred by the certificate. The author, having received the Templar degree under the old constitution, can affirm that in the ritual then practiced, no reference was made to those other degrees. On the settlement by the Supreme Council and the Grand Conclave, as already mentioned, in the year 1851, the degrees of Knight of Malta or Knight of St. John, the Prince Rose Croix, and also the Kadosh were separated from the Templar degree, a severance which caused at the time much dissatisfaction, and the heart-burnings arising from which can hardly yet be said to have subsided. The appointment of the Duke of Sussex himself, as derived from the Emperor Alexander, is liable to the following objections. The Knights Templar, it is acknowledged, were incorporated with the Knights of St. John or Knights of Malta, who, after their expulsion from that island, elected undoubtedly as their Grand Master the Emperor Paul of Russia. But the title of Grand Master, assumed by his son and successor Alexander, was never conferred by the votes of the order. On the contrary, after the assassination of Paul, they elected the Prince Caraccioli. After the removal of the order from Malta in 1800, the chief seat was transferred to Catania in Sicily, whence in 1826 it was removed by the Pope's authority to Ferrara. Having shown that the title of the Duke of Sussex, as derived from the Emperor of Russia, was, to say the least, unsatisfactory, are we not justified in taking another and very different view of the subject? The order, having in the course of time fallen into decay abroad, and infirmity having been displayed in its government and management, the English knights, whose encampments had been in a healthy condition for many years, were fully entitled to take the steps necessary for their own good government. And this course, we fully believe, would have been followed by the ancient brethren of the order had indecision or weakness manifested themselves at the fountainhead. Viewed from this point, the rule of the Duke of Sussex, accepted though not elected by the knights in England, seems perfectly satisfactory, nor can we see that any really important objection can be made to the assumption of the title of Grand Master, if the order think fit to confer it upon their head. There are several encampments in England claiming great antiquity. It is asserted that the encampment of Baldwin was established at Bristol by the Templars, who returned from Palestine with Richard I. It is still one of the most flourishing in England and has preserved the ancient costume and ceremonial of the order. This, with another at Bath and a third at York, constitute the 3 original preceptories of this kingdom. It must be confessed, however, that though there is no reason to doubt their authenticity, our information is derived only from the traditions current in these encampments. It would be more satisfactory if the members would communicate any facts corroborative of the statement. We cannot but think that in their archives is concealed much matter of interest to the order in general, and which would prove of value in any future regulations for the government of the fraternity, though at present they do not work in connection with the Grand Conclave. We hope that the time is not far distant when the different systems of our Masonic institution, in the higher as well as in the craft degrees, will be brought under one government. And we trust that an attempt will also be made to assimilate the workings in this country with that pursued under the sanction of the Grand Lodges of Scotland and Ireland, a consummation which would be welcomed by every true brother of the craft. It will be seen from the numerous list of encampments that the Templar institution is popular with English Masons. And although the ancient and accepted rite appears to be in some measure antagonistic, Yet with the rise and progress of the latter, Templarism continues to increase, and among its members are ranked some of the most distinguished Masons in the realm. In Scotland, the Templars have an organization different from our own and from that existing in any part of the world where this ancient order is to be found. The religious and military order of the Temple in Scotland consists of two classes. 1. Novice or Esquire. 2. Knight Templar. The Knights consist of 3 grades. 1. Knights created by priories. 2. Knights Commanders elected from the Knights on memorial to the Grand Master and Council, supported by the recommendation of the priories to which they belong. 3. Knights Grand Crosses, to be nominated by the Grand Master. The supreme legislative authority of the order is the Grand Conclave, which consists of the Grand Officers, the Knights Grand Crosses, the Knights Commanders, and the Prior of each priory. 4 chapters are held annually. At the meeting in March, the Grand Officers are elected. The Grand Master is elected triennially. The subordinate chapters are designated priories and are equivalent to our encampments. Thank you for watching, and please don't forget to share, like, subscribe and comment, and if you can please consider donating to Wars of the Roses. Links to PayPal and Patreon are in the description. Thank you so very much.